off this list, in our number 10 spot today we have Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States and is probably best known for his role in abolishing slavery. If you learned about American history in school, there is a good chance that Lincoln was included. One thing that is certainly quite a bit less well known about him is the fact that before he became a president, he was actually a champion wrestler. He was a larger man than I expected, standing at 6 feet 4 inches tall. He actually took part in around 300 matches, so it wasn't like this was just a small part of his life either. I'm not incredibly well versed in the world of wrestling, especially wrestling in the 1830s, but apparently he was quite a tough opponent and put up a very good fight. In our number 9 spot today we have Pope Gregory IX. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. Pope Gregory IX was the Bishop of Rome and was the ruler of the Papal States from 1227 until his passing in 1241. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that were under direct rule of the Pope from the 8th century all the way until 1870. Anyway, it turns out that Pope Gregory IX had a very strange hatred for cats. He said that black cats were actually instruments of Satan, which seems a little bit extreme, but then he actually went as far as to order that they be exterminated throughout Europe, which is definitely a little extreme. With this order, the Pope's followers had to oblige, and there was a drastic reduction in the cat population. But this, of course, caused a disturbance to the ecosystem at the time, and the consequences of that became very evident. Because of the decline of cats, there was a sudden increase in the amount of rats there were, most of which may have been carrying the plague. There are a lot of historians who would argue that this war on cats may have had a huge effect on the severity of the Black Plague. That is of course speculation, as it is pretty difficult to pinpoint who could be at fault for something like that, but it certainly is interesting. In our number 8 spot today we have Jeannette Rankin. Jeannette Rankin was an American politician and a huge advocate for women's rights. She was a pacifist who voted against both the declaration of war on Germany in 1917, as well as being the only member of Congress to vote against the declaration of war on Japan in 1941. There are quite a few crazy facts about Jeannette, such as the fact that she is the only woman from Montana to be elected to Congress, but one of the craziest facts about her is that she became the first female member of Congress in 1916, which was 4 years before women even had the right to vote. This is absolutely insane to me. She was of course incredibly instrumental in helping women get that right, and she actually introduced the legislation that became the 19th Constitutional Amendment, which granted women the unrestricted right to vote. I certainly am grateful for the work Jeannette did to help women's rights over her 60-year political career, and she certainly left quite the legacy. In our number 7 spot today we have Caligula. Caligula, who is formerly known as Gaius, was the 3rd Roman emperor from 37 AD to 41 AD. There isn't a ton that is known about his reign, but it is said that he was a great ruler for the first 6 months, but then he became a tyrant and was cruel and extravagant. He strived to ensure that the emperor gained more and more power. Caligula ended up being assassinated in early 41 because of his terrible leadership. It is crazy to say 41 as the year. The crazy fact that I have for you today about Caligula is that he was basically obsessed with one of his horses. He loved this horse so much that he gave him an ivory manger to sleep in, and even gave him his own palace and servants. This is already a little over the top, but he was actually planning on making him a senator. I suppose it's a good thing that at least he extended his wealth to one other living being instead of keeping it completely to himself, but making his horse a senator is both hilarious and very bizarre. In our number 6 spot today we have Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a Soviet politician who ruled the Soviet Union from 1920 until he passed away in 1953. He is one of the most significant figures of the 20th century and has left quite a controversial legacy. But today we are not here talking about political ideologies, but instead some crazy facts. One fact about Stalin that I was surprised to hear is that he would get photos of him retouched in order to remove people that he didn't like from them. In 2021, that is a lot more common and has been made a lot more accessible, but we are talking about a Russian dictator in the 1930s and 40s, long before Photoshop and the Facetune app existed. This does quickly take a pretty dark and serious turn though, as it really was used as a form of censorship and was basically a device to erase history, which can be quite dangerous. I do wonder if this practice of photo retouching ended up having an influence on how we do things today. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was an English comedian, actor, and filmmaker who was one of the most iconic figures in cinematic history. His career lasted over 75 years, and he first began to rise to fame during the silent film era. Closer to the end of his career, there were quite a few controversies surrounding him, but that certainly is nothing new for the life of an entertainer. Charlie's mustache became a very popular trend around 1915 to 1921, and in that time, there were a ton of look-alike competitions being held. One day, Charlie himself decided to enter one of these contests just to see. It is rumored that he lost his own look-alike competition, and not just by a little. Apparently, Charlie ended up coming close to last in this competition, which I'm not even sure how that is possible. There is little anecdotal evidence of this story, which leads some people to believe that it is an urban legend, but I do like to believe that this one is true. In our number 4 spot today, we have George Byron. George Byron was an English poet and politician who lived from 1788 until 1824. He is one of the best-known poets from the Romantic movements and is still regarded as one of the greatest English poets of all time. George was leading a campaign in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire when he passed away from a disease. When he was a young man and was attending university, he made quite an interesting move. The university had a rule that no dogs were allowed on the premises. A fair enough rule, and one that George would abide by. Although he couldn't bring a dog, the school didn't say anything about any other animals, so naturally George returned to school with a pet bear. The ethics of a pet bear are extremely questionable, but this happened 200 years ago, so we'll let that one slide for now. I feel like this type of move would not fly in 2021 for a multitude of reasons, but you truly cannot be mad at George for finding the loophole. In our number 3 spot today, we have Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI. Adding 2 more popes to this list because, to be honest, I am not sure who this crazy fact is for. Pope Formosus was the ruler of the Papal States from October 6th, 891 until he passed away on April 4th, 896. After his passing, Pope Boniface VI took his place as ruler for just a few weeks before he also passed away, which then left Pope Stephen VI as the ruler from then on until his death. After this whirlwind April of 896, things got even weirder. Before his passing, Pope Formosus had sided with Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto, which was definitely not okay with Pope Stephen VI. So, once Pope Stephen VI gets to the place of being the ruler, he gets the people to exhume the body of Pope Formosus so that he can put him on trial. I feel like that is super gross and very unnecessary, but this really is the type of stuff that went on in the 800s. They propped the body up for trial and had a deacon answer questions for him since he obviously was unable to do that himself. They ended up finding the corpse guilty, which seems a little unfair, and they actually went as far as to strip the body of its sacred vestments, took 3 fingers from the right hand as they were the blessing fingers, and then they dressed the body in regular people clothes instead of the clothing of a pope, and then they reburied the body. If this poor man's body hadn't been through enough though, it was later re-exhumed and thrown in the Tiber. If this story wasn't already wild enough, this whole debacle is actually what would later end up getting Pope Stephen imprisoned and killed. In our number 2 spot today, we have Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison is of course one of the most well-known American inventors for quite a few different innovations. The founder of Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, actually worked for Thomas at the Edison Illuminating Company in the 1890s. Henry certainly admired Thomas and was excited when he got the chance to meet him. When Harry met him, he made sure to explain to Thomas the plans that he had for his new automobile, and this conversation was what really inspired Henry to make his prototype prototype of the Model T. From then on, the pair shared a friendship and kept in contact. In 1931, Thomas passed away after complications with diabetes. It turns out that as he was passing, Henry had convinced Thomas's son to hold a test tube to Thomas's mouth so as to catch his last breath. There are a lot of people who believe that this was Henry's attempt at catching his soul as it left his body, but that theory makes me a little uncomfortable. The test tube that was used to capture his last breath has made its way to be on display at the Henry Ford Museum that is located in Detroit. In our number 1 spot today, we have Galileo Galilei. Galileo Galilei left quite a legacy as one of the most famous astronomers, physicists, and engineers we've ever seen. He has even been called the father of the scientific method, as well as the father of modern science. One of the most well-known stories about him was when he heard about the construction of the telescope, he made his own, even better version without even having seen the first version beforehand. This is all to say that he was incredibly smart and really paved the way for a lot of scientific advancements. Galileo ended up passing away when he was 77 years old on January 8th, 1642. What is crazy and very bizarre is that before he was buried, some of his admirers removed 3 of his fingers and a tooth from his body so that they would have keepsakes, I guess? Maybe that was normal for 1642, but in 2021 it definitely is a little different. In a stranger turn of events, these body parts have actually been kept since 1642 and now reside on display at the Museo Galileo in Florence, Italy.
Coming in at number 10, heroin used to be used as a children's cough syrup. German drug company Bayer made a heck of a lot of money selling heroin to parents. Get a load of these babies! Heroin was a prescription drug in the US until 1914, and then it was banned in 1924. Can you imagine how children would be after a sweet dose of Bayer heroin? Like, Christ. Coming in at number 9, Hugo Boss designed Nazi party uniforms. Hugo Boss is a luxury German fashion house that now sells its product globally and is frequently seen on runways. The designer brand started up in 1924 and originally supplied the Nazi party. This all went down before and during World War II. Comedian Russell Brand was actually even ousted from the GQ Man of the Year awards after making Nazi jibes at the brand in 2013. So, remember Thomas Edison from your history lessons? You know, the light bulb guy. Well, he had a very dark side that your teachers did not tell you about. He actually murdered an elephant, and this is coming in at number 8. Thomas Edison devoted his life to working with electricity. Unfortunately, he got pretty brutal when he needed to prove a point. In 1903, the American inventor murdered an elephant to prove that an alternating current was a bad idea. He even invited 1,500 people to watch as he murdered Topsy the elephant at Luna Park Zoo on Coney Island. He also filmed it and released the footage to the public, and it's actually really heartbreaking to watch. I would say I'd boycott light bulbs, but not really an option. Coming in at number 7, remember that song that you guys used to sing as a kid in the playground, the Ring a Ring a Roses one? Well, it's actually a death song. Ring a Ring a Roses is a song about people dying from the plague. Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. You know how it goes. So Ring o' Roses refers to the rash that plague victims would develop. The pocket full of posies refers to herbs that people would carry around to protect themselves from the plague. The a tissue bit is like people sneezing like a sick person, and we all know what all fall down means. That's people physically dropping down dead and dying from the plague. Fun. Okay, next up. In school I was taught a lot about the Roman Empire, but I was never taught this. At number 6, Romans used to use human urine as mouthwash and crushed mouse brains as toothpaste. Gross. Blah. Get the mouse brains out of my mouth. Get the mouse brains out of my mouth. I guess they had to keep their breaths fresh somehow, but yeah, I don't know, urine wouldn't be my choice. They also used urine to clean their clothes. This is basically because ammonia, which is found in pee, takes out stains, so basically they were more concerned with having white teeth than fresh, non-pee smelling breath. Personally, I'd really pass on cleaning my teeth with pee and brains. It's just a personal choice. Coming in at number 5, Saddam Hussein was actually given the key to the city of Detroit. History paints Saddam Hussein as a bad guy, mainly because he was indeed a bad guy. But Nonetheless, after making a donation to a church in Detroit in 1979, basically because a reverend praised him, he was handed the city keys. The American history books aren't so proud of that one. Coming in at number 4, famous explorer Christopher Columbus used to rape children. Yeah, so I guess that kind of extinguishes the yay for Columbus and his explorations party. In some places, people even go as far as to celebrate a Christopher Columbus Day. The problem is, not only was he awful to the indigenous people, he also raped them, including the kids. He would often give his lieutenants sex slaves, and he even wrote in one of his diaries that girls from age 9 to 10 were the most desirable. Gross. Gross. Coming in at number 3, schools don't teach us much about Nazi twin experiments. I don't know how much history has shielded people about the kind of experiments that Nazi warlords did on concentration camp victims. Obviously we know that they were gassed, but school history books do leave out a few choice facts. I know a lot about the Josef Mengele experiments, but that's because I've done extensive research on that area of history. A lot of people do not know about the veteran Nazis' sick experiments on twins and other such horrific medical tests. Mengele would inject chemicals into twins' bodies, especially their eyes, and try and change their colours. Later, when he was done with them, he'd murder them. Another Nazi, Isle Koch, allegedly made lamps from human skin. Coming in at number 2, we often don't know the extent of Japanese cruelty in World War II. Possibly because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were so horrific to humanity and the pain echoed throughout Japan for a great deal of time, the extent of Japanese killing in World War II is somewhat brushed over by history. Of course, all countries involved inflicted pain and suffering, but did you know that the Japanese torture methods were considered to be the most severe? Did you know that Japanese killed more Chinese soldiers than the number of the entire Jews killed in the Holocaust? Also, Japan wounded more Americans in Alaska than at Pearl Harbor. There were also swathes of reports of Japanese cannibalism and cruelty. Of course, this far into the future, we have to live and let live, but Nazi Germany gets the lion's share of the blame for atrocities, and Japanese war crimes are largely glossed over. Finally, just when you thought we were sort of semi-living in a time of peace, you may not know that Russia and Japan are technically still at war. Two powerful countries who are still sour post-World War II. Yeesh. Even though the countries haven't been engaging in hot war for over 70 years, they never signed a peace treaty officially indicating peacetime between the two nations. The pair still disagree heavily over the Kuril Islands. I for one really hope that they never engage in war again, because that could be devastating for everyone.
Number 10. Chinese foot binding wasn't just to please men. Women have historically gone to extreme measures to meet cultural standards of beauty to attract the opposite sex, from wearing tight corsets to walking in heels. In China, this standard of beauty was achieved by foot binding. A young girl's bones were broken and her feet tightly bound so that her lotus feet now appeared small and dainty. In their research book Bound Feet, Young Hands, author Lauren Bosman and Hill Gates revealed that some girls' feet were bound at a very young age, not to catch a husband, but to force them to work. What's groundbreaking about our work is that foot binding was not confined to the elite. Lauren, the book's co-author, told HuffPost. The study, Lauren added, dispels the view that the goal was only to try to please men. The authors interviewed over 1,800 women across China to uncover that foot binding was prevalent among many peasant families to create immobility for girls so that they would stick around and do hard work that their families depended on for selling goods. And I feel like hearing this just makes it even worse. Number 9. Alexander Graham Bell didn't invent the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell wasn't the inventor of the telephone like we were all taught, but he was the first to patent it. Turns out Bell was actually one of several men who were working on the telephone idea at the same time, but he got to the patent office before them. However, in 2002, US Congress recognized impoverished Florentine immigrant as the inventor of the telephone rather than Alexander Graham Bell. The Guardian reported historians and Italian Americans won their battle to pursue Washington to recognize a little-known mechanical medical genius Antonio Meucci as the father of modern communications 113 years after his death. The resolution declared Antonio's teledeferno, demonstrated in New York in 1860, made him the inventor of the telephone in the place of Bell, even though it was Bell who took out a patent 16 years later. It is the sense of the House of Representatives that the life and achievements of Antonio Meucci should be recognized and his work in the invention of the telephone should be acknowledged, the resolution stated. So he didn't invent it, he just made it first. Number 8. Vincent van Gogh wasn't romantic. The story of Vincent van Gogh's severed ear is legendary in the art world, but he definitely didn't do it for love or mail it to his girlfriend. Van Gogh cut off his left ear when tempers flared with Paul Gauguin, the artist with whom he had been working for. It wasn't for love, it happened during one of his mental breakdowns. Also, there's a rumor that he ate yellow paint in hopes to be happy. Now this has never been proven, but if he did eat specifically yellow paint, it wasn't to make him happy. He struggled with mental health issues, yes, but he would have eaten it because he knew it was bad for him and he wanted to end his life. He was smart enough to know that eating it wouldn't make him happy. Like, come on. During his time at the institution in Saint Remy, he wrote a letter to Theo. It appears that I pick up filthy things and eat them, although my memories of these bad moments are vague. The medical notes of Dr. Pryron, his physician, revealed that he wanted to poison himself by eating paint and drinking turpentine. That's probably why he wasn't allowed in his studio while he was suffering from his attacks. So no, it wasn't because he wanted to be happy, it was because he wanted to end his life. So no, he did not do any of these things because it was romantic, it was because he was mentally ill and struggling. Number 7. The Wright brothers weren't the first to fly. We were taught that the Wright brothers were the first men to fly, but that is wrong. They did come up with the first truly controllable aircraft, but the real claim for first in flight fame goes to German immigrant named Gustav Whitehead that occurred in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In 2013, Jane's All the World's Aircraft, which calls itself the world's foremost authority on aviation history, named the August 1901 flight by Whitehead as the first successful powered flight in history. Jane reviewed evidence from aviation researcher John Brown that Whitehead may have made 1 and possibly 2 flights in a small monoplane of his own design and powered by a tiny motor also of his own design as early as 1901, which was 2 full years before the Wright brothers. Number 6. America wasn't the good guy in World War II. Okay, I know how that sounds, so hear me out. World War II is often hailed as the last war where there were clean lines between the good guys and bad guys. The Axis powers wanted to take over the world, the Allies wanted to stop them. But it's not that simple. American GIs were responsible for war crimes on par with the acts committed by their Japanese and German enemies. For example, in 1943, US soldiers invaded the island of Sicily and ended the lives of at least 77 POWs in what's known as the Biscari Massacre. Even though they were fighting for freedom, these troops threw the Geneva Convention right out the window. GIs were also responsible for taking advantage of approximately 14,000 women in England, Germany, and France from 1942 to 1945. However, things took a truly barbaric turn in the Pacific Theater. Even though it was illegal, American troops made it a habit of taking trophies from dead Japanese soldiers. And not fumbling through their pockets or taking their weapons, GIs actually chopped off ears, pulled out teeth, and took bones as mementos to send to their parents, wives, and girlfriends. Number 5. Residential schools. Many people think Canada is all sunshine and rainbows, but we actually have our own dark past. In Canada, the Indian residential school system was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous peoples. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administrated by Christian churches. The school system was created to isolate Indigenous children from the influence of their own culture and religion in order to assimilate them into the dominant Canadian culture. Over the course of the system's more than 100-year existence, around 150,000 children were placed in residential schools nationally. The residential school system harmed Indigenous children significantly by removing them from their families, depriving them of their ancestral languages, and mistreating them both physically and mentally. Conditions in the school led to student malnutrition, starvation, and disease. The legacy of the system has been linked to increased prevalence of post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, use of illegal substances, substances, and generational trauma in Indigenous peoples. The number of school-related deaths remains unknown due to incomplete records, but estimates range from 3,200 to over 30,000, and there are thousands of unmarked graves for the poor students. It's disgusting that this happened, and Canada has still not shown how sorry they are for these crimes. Number 4. Only gay men got AIDS. The AIDS epidemic caused by HIV found its way to the United States between the 1970s and 1980s. During the epidemic of the 1980s, LGBTQ+ communities were further stigmatized as they became the focus of mass hysteria, suffered isolation and marginalization, and were targeted with extreme attacks of violence in the United States. This is because it was known as a gay disease, which simply isn't true. Diseases don't discriminate based on sexual orientation, but due to this myth, many people didn't get the help they needed when it came to AIDS. One of the best known works on the history of HIV and AIDS is the 1987 book And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz, which claims that Ronald Reagan's administration dragged its feet in dealing with the crisis due to homophobia, while the gay community viewed early reports and public health measures with corresponding distrust, thus allowing the disease to spread further and infect hundreds of thousands more. US leaders had remained largely silent and unresponsive to the health emergency, and it wasn't until September 1985, 4 years after the crisis began, that President Ronald Reagan first publicly mentioned AIDS. If Reagan took steps 4 years earlier to help and wasn't so homophobic, many lives would have been saved. But he ignored it. As of 2018, 700,000 people have died of HIV or AIDS in the United States since the beginning of the epidemic, and nearly 13,000 people with AIDS in the United States die each year. Number 3. Slavery wasn't just in the South. Though school taught us something different, Southerners were not the only ones who owned slaves in the United States. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington told Northern and Southern colonists that we must fight the British so we don't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. By 1804, slavery was abolished in the North, but not all at once. Some states left in provisions to slowly free slaves over time, and by 1840, Connecticut still had 17 slaves listed on the census. In New York City, the situation was especially shameful. A fifth of the city's population was slaves in 1740, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. 42% of residents owned slaves, according to the New York Public Library. 42%. Slave labor built much of the city, and although they didn't have to work on plantations, they were still considered property to be bought, sold, and used. Number 2. The truth about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving didn't start off happy like it is now. According to Ramona Peters, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe's tribal historic preservation officer, quoted in the Indian Country Today media network, President Lincoln promoted the celebration of a happy meal between the Pilgrims and the Indians to create a feeling of harmony and bring together a country after the Civil War. But there was nothing harmonious about how the Thanksgiving holiday came about, as it resulted in the death of an entire Indian tribe. In 1636, when a dead man was discovered in a boat in Plymouth, English Major John Mason and his soldiers blamed the Piquet Indians. They then ended the lives of 400 of them in retribution, including women and the young. The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Newell, proclaimed, "From this day forth shall be a day of celebration and thanksgiving for subduing the Piquets." So yeah, it wasn't at all happy, it was dark. Really dark. And coming in at number 1 is Gandhi wasn't as great as he seemed. Gandhi inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world, but most of us don't know that Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male bodybuilder before he got involved in British-Indian relations. Now, if Gandhi was gay, who cares? But Gandhi tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing. And to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he would sleep in bed naked with young women, including his grandnieces. But worse than his sexual hypocrisy was his terrible racism. Gandhi may have wanted India freed from British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the rigid caste system of the nation. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were led to a lower caste jail for protesting. "We could understand not being classed with whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. They are as a rule uncivilized, the convicts even more so. They're troublesome, very dirty and live like animals. When asked about Indian views on race versus white South Africans, he wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do." Although Gandhi did bring some good to the world, it's important to note that he wasn't as great as he seemed, and people need to know this.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, Mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Starting us off at number 10 is divorce. While today you can pretty much get a divorce for, well, really any reason you want, that wasn't always the case. In fact, prior to being able to file over irreconcilable differences like most couples do now, pretty much only men were allowed to divorce their wives, not the other way around. Unless, that is, the wife could prove her husband's impotence, as it was seen as a woman's legal duty to bestow a child to her husband. If he couldn't give her the goods per se, she could file for an annulment of the marriage. But how did the court go about proving this, you ask? Well, of course they couldn't just take the woman's word for it, so they would bring in a witness, usually a sex worker, to try and arouse the man. That, or the court would enter your marital bedroom and, well, you know, see for themselves just how well the man could get the job done. If he did in fact have any issues completing his manly duties, the woman could be freed of the marriage. Just be careful they don't accuse you of becoming a witch. Next up at number 9 is man-made fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 resulted in the death of an estimated 60,000 soldiers, but not many of these bones have ever been recovered, and the reason why is pretty grim. In a strange, twisted series of events, the English decided to clear the field of the corpses and put the bones to use in a rather effective, but albeit creepy way. Newspapers of the time reported that the fallen French army were ground up in Yorkshire factories, and the bone dust was added to their manure. Apparently the oil from the marrow proved especially helpful in the grave robbing turned fertilizer plan, and the fertilizer was purchased by farmers across England and scattered widely to help grow their crops, meaning that an entire generation of England ate food made possible with the help of dead French soldiers. Coming in at number 8 is Qin Shi Huang. Before the understanding of modern science, there was a lot of ideas about elixirs and remedies that have quite literally no logic to back them up. Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They truthfully didn't know any better. But looking back, that doesn't make it any less wild. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was one of the many intent on finding the elixir of immortality, and so he demanded his royal doctors find this magical potion for him, otherwise he would have them killed. I mean, just real low stakes stuff. Eventually, likely under the duress of not wanting to be killed and also probably not knowing what they were doing, they offered him a magic potion that they promised would bring him eternal life. The magic potion, however, was actually just mercury, and the emperor ended up dying from poisoning himself. A bit ironic that in the pursuit of eternal life, he actually only made his life shorter. Coming in at number 7 is Henry Rathbone. During school, we all learned about John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington. But did you know that that wasn't the only tragedy to occur due to that night's events? In the theater with Lincoln that night was his wife, along with Henry Rathbone, a military officer, and his girlfriend Clara. At the time of the assassination, Rathbone saw Booth and tried to save Lincoln, but Booth stabbed him before he could reach the president. Although he physically survived the attack, he left with a deep-seated guilt about not being able to save the president's life. 2 years went by, and despite trying to move on from the tragedy by marrying Clara and starting a family, his mind never fully recovered and he became more and more paranoid about the world around him. He began claiming to hear voices speak to him from behind the walls that would taunt him endlessly, until eventually they pushed him towards complete breakdown. Convinced it was the only option, Rathbone shot and killed his wife before stabbing himself in an attempt to take his own. But just like before, he survived the attack on himself. Eventually he was tried for killing his wife and sent to live the rest of his life in an asylum. Coming in at number 6 is an animal trial. So not only did they have trials over the impotence of a man, believe it or not, you could also take a literal animal to court in the Middle Ages. I kid you not. The whole kit and caboodle would be present. A judge, prosecutor, witnesses, a defense attorney. They truly took it very seriously. The reasoning behind it all, I suppose, was that at the time, law prohibited punishment without trial for everything and everyone. The first recorded instance was the prosecution of a pig in France in 1266, accused of eating a young boy. The pig was found guilty for his crime and executed as punishment. If that doesn't sound crazy enough, keep in mind the judge would hold the behavior of the accused animal against it, and if the court didn't feel the animal was acting properly, that was taken into account. These trials were only put on against domestic animals, as they truly believed, having been in the company of humans, they should know how to act. Now, not all animals were executed for their crimes. Some lesser criminals were merely excommunicated from the church or cursed and sent to live in the wild, but it's still crazy. I mean, honestly, I wish I was making this up. Coming in at number 5 is John Scott Harrison. Raised by the 9th President of the US, William Henry, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, although John Scott himself never rose to presidential ranks, he did serve 2 years in Congress and was a prominent political figure in his time. But one day he decided politics wasn't really for him anymore and spent his last 20 years managing a farm in Ohio. After his death in 1878, his family gathered for the service and took great pains to protect his grave. At the time, grave robbing was at an all-time peak due to the demand for cadavers in medical schools. To avoid having his father be another subject of this, Benjamin had an unusually deep grave made and placed a massive stone that required 16 men to move placed on top of his casket. For extra measure, he then covered the whole ordeal in cement, then placed small wooden pegs below the surface of the covering so that he could tell if it had been disturbed. Oh, and he hired a security guard to watch it day and night for the next 30 days. After noticing a nearby family friend's grave had been exhumed, Benjamin and his nephew went to go and track it down. They managed to obtain a warrant for the Medical College of Ohio, and with the help of a detective went to retrieve the corpse of their dear friend. When they arrived, they found a dissecting room on the top floor, but to their surprise they couldn't find who they were looking for. Instead, they happened upon a body that looked strangely familiar, and when they removed the rags covering the head, they were horrified to discover it was the corpse of one Mr. John Scott Harrison. How the grave robber managed, we will never know. Next up at number 4 is La Custa. The Pax Romana is known for being one of the most peaceful times in history. The Romans had pretty much conquered what they set out to, and so they began to, just chill out for a bit. Then along came La Custa, esteemed maker of poisons and the world's first serial killer. Well, more like a hired assassin by the Roman Empire. Locusta was routinely caught poisoning people, and despite frequent arrests for her killings, was always let free. Why is that? Well, the Empire got word and decided they could use her to their advantage. Her first big gig came from Empress Agrippina to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius. Locusta complied with glee and assassinated the emperor. However, soon after, Agrippina threw her under the bus for the crime. But now, under the ruling of Lord Nero, he saved her for his own devilish plots. For the next 15 years under Nero, she worked consistently and was even awarded for her service. Locusta received a villa and even a small staff to help her in her poisonous endeavors. Nero even went as far to provide her with her own school for the profession. But after Nero was sentenced to death, Locusta lost her security blanket and lawful immunity and was executed by the emperor for her crimes. Coming in at number 3 is Gilles de Rais. Joan of Arc is, rightfully so, credited as a certified badass and patron saint who was a major defender of the French during the 100 Years' War. Among her most supportive and trusted allies was Gilles de Rais, an esteemed knight in the French army who was appointed the highest military distinction one could receive at the time. But if he was such a big deal and close companion of Joan, why isn't he as widely celebrated? Well, that's because sadly he was actually super evil. By day he was defending France beside Joan of Arc, but at night he was into the senseless killing of minors in occultist rituals. Often he would lure the unsuspecting victims in with psychological torture, convincing them that it was just a game, before bludgeoning them and doing other cruel and unspeakable things to their corpses, supposedly using them for his rituals. Eventually he was found out and tried for his crimes, admitting to all his vicious acts and hanged as punishment. Although no one knows for sure, it's suspected he had nearly 150 victims. Coming in at number 2 is virginity tests. Back in a time when a woman was merely the property of her husband, there was one very important thing that needed to be assured before the wedding night: that she was pure. Mostly because it was believed that the consummation in fact kind of sealed the whole husband owning his wife deal, and if she had done it with anyone else, she didn't really belong to him. Charming. So to ensure that their potential wife was worth the dowry, suitors would perform virginity tests on their brides to make sure they weren't getting a second-hand woman, if you will. Such tests included inspecting their urine, as it was believed a virgin's urine would be clear. Other times they would give the woman a special potion, and if she could refrain from peeing, she was a virgin, as if a bladder was any indication of that. Sometimes a physician would be hired to inspect the woman's downstairs area, as they believed they could literally just tell by looking at it. Most common though was to inspect the sheets after the marriage was consummated. If there was blood, hooray, a virgin. If not, well then it was assumed she was a liar and her husband was legally entitled to compensation for being swindled into marrying her. And last up today are syphilis zombies. Sometimes it's easy to forget just how much antibiotics have changed the world around us. While nowadays a shot of penicillin can keep an early onset of the STI at bay, back in the day it could quite literally be the end of you. In fact, in 1494, Italy experienced one of the worst outbreaks in history, and if you didn't know any better, you might have thought it was a zombie apocalypse. Of course, before there was any kind of real understanding about how these types of diseases could be spread or caught, people were, let's just say, having a lot of fun with each other. But on the flip side of that, if they caught the infection, it would cause flesh to literally dissolve off their bodies until their inevitable death within a few months. It was also widely believed that bedding a virgin could cure you of the disease, so that's fun. Apparently, it was not uncommon to witness people missing hands, feet, eyes, noses, or look as if they'd been dropped into a vat of acid while walking down the street. Also remember that it took a few months before the disease actually killed them, so they were just living in excruciating pain while their flesh was slowly eaten away, in some cases right down to the bone. With that image in mind, it does make a little bit more sense as to why they believed you would go to hell for premarital relations. Like, I kind of get why they thought it was the devil punishing you for your sins. Thank God for antibiotics. Shall we? Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas Cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas Cradle, and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man, oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are transy tombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with transy tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the 4 humors. The 4 humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are 4 main humors or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife, and for the purposes of procreation, was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did, Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13 as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first, she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed, so in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange. That his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully, I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would mutilate the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe, there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation. Hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you are not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason, there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, cause actually what the heck is that?